It began on a clear September morning in 2001, a day that would reshape global politics, redefine warfare, and launch a conflict with no clear battlefield and no clear end. This is the story of the War on Terror. If you've ever wondered how a single day could spark a decades-long global conflict, or why wars were fought in places many people couldn't even find on a map, you're in the right place, because the War on Terror isn't just a story about battles or governments. It's a story about fear, power, ideology, and the unintended consequences of decisions made under pressure. And to really understand it, we need to go back, not to 2001, but decades earlier, back to the Cold War. In the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, the world was divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Each was competing for influence across the globe. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, hoping to support a friendly government and maintain control in the region. But the invasion triggered resistance. Local fighters, known as the Mujahideen, rose up against Soviet forces, and they weren't alone. The United States, along with other countries, began supporting these fighters with money, weapons, and training. It was a classic Cold War strategy. Weaken your opponent without direct confrontation. You can think of it like a massive chess match, with Afghanistan as the board and its people caught in the middle. Among the thousands of foreign volunteers who came to fight was a young Saudi man named Osama bin Laden. At the time, he wasn't widely known. He wasn't the global figure he would later become. He was one of many who saw the conflict as a religious and political struggle. When the Soviets withdrew in 1989, it was seen as a victory for the Mujahideen and their supporters. But victory didn't bring peace. Afghanistan was left devastated, infrastructure destroyed, millions displaced, and perhaps most importantly, there was no stable government to take control. Different factions began fighting each other for power. Out of that chaos, the Taliban emerged, a group that promised order but enforced it through strict and often brutal interpretations of law. At the same time, something else was forming. Osama bin Laden, drawing from his experiences and connections, helped create a network that would later be known as Al-Qaeda, meaning the base. This wasn't an army in the traditional sense. It didn't wear uniforms, it didn't hold territory in the way nations do. Instead, it operated through cells, small, decentralized groups spread across different countries. Its goal was ambitious and extreme: to remove Western influence from Muslim-majority regions and to challenge what it saw as unjust global power structures. Throughout the 1990s, Al-Qaeda carried out a series of attacks. In 1998, U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were bombed, killing hundreds. In 2000, the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy ship, was attacked in Yemen. These weren't isolated incidents. They were signals, but they didn't yet trigger a full-scale global response. That changed in 2001.
On September 11th, 4 commercial airplanes were hijacked. 2 were flown into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, 1 struck the Pentagon, and the 4th crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers attempted to regain control. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The images spread instantly across the world. For many, it felt like the moment the 21st century truly began. For the United States, it was not just an attack, it was a turning point. Within days, the government declared a war on terror. This was something new. Not a war against a specific country, but against a method of violence, against networks that could exist anywhere, against an idea. The first step in this new war was Afghanistan. The Taliban government was accused of harboring al-Qaeda and refusing to hand over Osama bin Laden. In October 2001, U.S. and allied forces launched an invasion. The initial phase moved quickly. Taliban forces were pushed out of major cities. Al-Qaeda training camps were destroyed. Many leaders fled or went into hiding. It looked, at first, like a rapid success. But beneath the surface, the conditions for a longer conflict were already forming. Because removing a government is one thing. Replacing it with a stable, functioning system is something else entirely. As international forces attempted to rebuild Afghanistan, insurgent groups began to reorganize. The Taliban and other fighters adapted their strategies. Instead of direct confrontation, they used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, roadside bombs, and hit-and-run attacks. There was no clear front line, no obvious battlefield. It became a war defined by uncertainty. Soldiers often couldn't tell who the enemy was, and civilians were frequently caught in the middle. Meanwhile, the scope of the war on terror expanded. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The official reasons included the belief that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a threat. There were also claims of connections to terrorist groups, but these justifications would later become highly controversial. No stockpiles of such weapons were found, and the link to the 9/11 attacks remained disputed. Still, the invasion reshaped the region. The Iraqi government was quickly overthrown, but without a strong plan for what came next, instability spread. Government institutions weakened. Security collapsed in many areas. Different groups began competing for power. This created fertile ground for insurgency. Violence escalated, often along sectarian lines, dividing communities that had once coexisted. And out of this chaos, new extremist groups emerged. One of them would eventually become ISIS. ISIS, the Islamic State, took advantage of instability in both Iraq and neighboring Syria. It wasn't just another insurgent group. It aimed to build something larger, a self-declared state. At its peak, ISIS controlled vast territories, governed millions of people, and operated with surprising organization. It used modern technology to spread its message, recruit followers, and broadcast its actions to the world. Its methods were deliberately shocking. Violence was not just a tactic, it was part of its strategy to instill fear and gain attention. This marked another evolution in the war on terror. The response involved international coalitions, coordinated airstrikes, intelligence operations, and support for local forces on the ground. Gradually, ISIS began to lose territory. By 2019, its control over major cities had largely collapsed. But, like earlier groups, it didn't disappear entirely. It shifted back into a more decentralized form. Meanwhile, in 2011, one of the most symbolic moments of the war on terror took place. After years of searching, Osama bin Laden was located in Pakistan. In a carefully planned nighttime operation, U.S. forces carried out a raid on the compound where he was hiding. He was killed during the mission. For many, this felt like a form of closure. The figure most associated with the 9/11 attacks was gone. But the larger conflict continued, because by that point, the war on terror had become much bigger than one individual or one organization. It had spread across regions, across ideologies, and across generations. Back in Afghanistan, the war continued. Year after year, efforts were made to stabilize the country. Elections were held, governments were formed, international aid flowed in. But challenges remained. Corruption, internal divisions, and ongoing insurgency made lasting stability difficult. After nearly 2 decades of conflict, the United States began planning its withdrawal. In 2021, that withdrawal was completed. What followed was rapid and unexpected. The Afghan government collapsed faster than many had predicted, and the Taliban returned to power. The same group that had been removed at the start of the war on terror was once again in control. For many observers, this raised difficult and uncomfortable questions. What had been achieved? What had been lost? And what lessons, if any, had been learned? The war on terror left a deep and lasting impact on the world. Security measures increased dramatically. Air travel changed. Surveillance programs expanded. Governments gained new powers in the name of preventing attacks. Military strategies also evolved. There was a greater focus on counterinsurgency, intelligence gathering, and unconventional warfare. But the consequences were not only strategic. Entire regions experienced prolonged instability. Millions of people were displaced. Countless lives were affected, directly and indirectly. And perhaps one of the most important lessons is this. Modern conflicts are rarely simple. They don't always have clear beginnings or endings. They don't always have decisive victories. The war on terror was not a traditional war with a clear endpoint. It was a response to a type of threat, one that adapts, evolves, and persists. So when people ask whether the war on terror is over, the answer depends on how you define it. Large-scale military operations have decreased. Some major groups have been weakened. But the underlying conditions, political tensions, ideological conflicts, regional instability, still exist. And as long as those conditions remain, the risk of similar conflicts continues. History doesn't always offer neat conclusions. Sometimes, it leaves us with ongoing questions instead of final answers. And sometimes, the most important thing we can do is try to understand. Because understanding the past doesn't just explain what happened. It helps us recognize patterns, avoid repeating mistakes, and navigate the future with clearer perspective. The war on terror is still part of our present, and its story is still being written.